Bonjour, bon après-midi ou bonne matinée pour ceux qui sont
Good
peut-être de l'autre.
morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which side of the Atlantic you are on at the moment. I would like to wish you all a very good afternoon. For most of you who are following this webinar this afternoon, we are very lucky for this second, or is it our third time that we have been asked to organize a webinar by the OECD, and we will be commenting on their beautiful report that has just come out with regards to multilateral cooperation. This report was highly awaited, and it is very important for us this year. Why? Because we are all looking at preparing the fourth conference of the United Nations on um, sustainable development financing. And this is a good foot in the door so that we can talk about the major issues in preparation of this conference. The report was very rich, it was very well presented with wonderful graphs and images. We are going to be starting by giving the floor to Olivier Cattaneo, who's the head of the unit, chief editor of the reports, and he will be talking us through the primary conclusions. Following this, we will be giving the floor to other speakers, focusing our debate on a very important issue at hand, which is obviously that of that is also touched upon in the report. And this is an issue that all of the different panels will be talking about. Obviously, I'm talking about multilateral organizations and the way they allocate their funding to poor and vulnerable countries. We are going to have a look at, once again, the poor and vulnerable countries. And when we say vulnerable here, how are we going to ascertain which countries are vulnerable? Because this is something that we lost sight of following the Paris summit. And I know that a lot of stakeholders are trying to breathe a second wind into this issue. This is exactly what the executive director was looking at. Abdoul Salam Bello, who is obviously the executive director of the Africa Group 2 at the World Bank Group Board of Directors. In fact, I will maybe talk us through the different speakers who will be taking the floor. I've already spoken about um, Abdul Salam. Thank you very much for being here with us today. We were actually able to spend some time together in New York last week when we partook in an event on financing for the least developed countries. We were also able to look at the fourth conference on development, and I will maybe be giving him the floor towards the end of our webinar because he will have more of a political stance on the different issues that will be addressed by the rest of the speakers. I've obviously mentioned that Olivier Cattaneo, who will be giving us a presentation, him being one of the primary contributors, if not the primary contributor to this report. And then we're very lucky also to have a representative from one of the least developed countries, Madagascar. Madagascar is concerned by the different multilateral flows of cooperation that we see stemming from reports such as the one that has been written. We will also be giving the floor to Lisa Chauvet, who is Professor of Economics, University Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne. We, as I mentioned, will then be giving the floor to Hary Ralarosy, who works at the Central Bank of Madagascar. I'm very sorry if I am unable to say the pronounce the name of the bank, so we will just call it the BFM rather, because I don't speak Malagasy, says the speaker. She is a specialist of all questions linked to finance, and we are very lucky to work in close collaboration with her and her bank. As I mentioned, this is the Central Bank of Madagascar, which looks for international collaboration. In addition, as I mentioned, we will then be giving the floor to Lisa Chauvet, who is a professor of economics, one of the best specialists. She comes from the Université Paris 1. She will be addressing the political side of international aid and public financing. She has undertaken lots of different works, including that of allocation of aid. and we were able to work together in the early parts of both our careers. We will be starting with you, Olivier.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you
Je
very
vais
much.
partager mon
I'm going to try
écran.
and share my screen to get things started.
Euh,
I hope that you're able to see my screen. We can
Voilà,
do
donc merci
indeed.
beaucoup.
Thank
Merci
you
pour
very
cette
much. Thank you very much,
présentation.
Patrick,
Merci
for
beaucoup
this
pour
wonderful
la
introduction, and thank you
collaboration que vous
for all
pouvez
of the work that you have
réaliser.
been
Je
doing
crois que c'est
alongside the
la troisième
OECD. I
fois
believe
que
that
nous
this is the third time,
participons
as you mentioned,
ensemble.
that we're able to
On avait
participate
décidé
in a
quand
FERDI
on
webinar.
lançait notre
We
rapport
decided that we were going to launch
que c'était la
our
fin d'un processus,
reports,
mais
and
le
we didn't
début
think
d'un
that it was the
processus.
end of a
Et on
process,
discutait
but
avec
rather the beginning of a
différents
chapter. We've been
partenaires de
speaking with different of
recherche
our partner
en
institutions
perspective
so that we're able to really
d'une
put this into
solution
perspective when it comes to
alternative au
multilateral
développement.
development finance.
Cette année, on a 18
This year, we
institutions
have
qui célébraient
18 institutions that are working
et
alongside us,
effectivement,
13
c'est
countries as well. I'm
l'occasion en
delighted
français
to
pour
be able to give
discuter
this
de
presentation in
FERDI. C'est
French
le
at
seul
FERDI because it is the only institution, the only
événement
event in which I'm able to speak in
j'ai été
French.
faire de mon
I'm
mieux
going to
pour
try and do my best, even though I'm
développer
more used to giving this
l'opinion des
presentation in English.
rapport
I will be
brièvement
presenting the OECD
présentant d'abord
Multilateral Development
les
Finance
tendances
2024 report. I will be
du
starting off with different trends that
multilatéral
we've
et
seen
du
for
développement
multilateral
en
financing.
montrant sur
I
le
will
panel
start
tableau
by
suivant
showing
que
the
le
on the
financement
left-hand side, you can see that
augmente
financing is
de manière
increasing. It is on the
significative,
rise, and this in a
y
significant
compris
fashion,
avec
including
ce qu'on a
when we look
appelé
at the last year, so
les effets
2022, and
de la
this
guerre
because
en
of
Ukraine. On
the
reviendra
war
là-dessus.
in Ukraine,
Ce
but I
qui est
will come back
important
to this
aussi,
point
qu'on
in an
voit sur la
instant.
droite,
However, you
c'est
can
un
also see on the right-hand
pourcentage
side that this represents a
important
growing share of OECD DAC
de pays
members
maintenant
when
à
it comes
l'horizon de la
to
fin de
aid.
la décennie qui
Especially towards the
aident
end of the year, we've got
et
half of
transitent par le
aid
système
that transits
multilatéral.
through
Bref,
the
on est bien sur
multilateral system,
le
so through
système
multilateral organizations rather than bilateral.
Je viens de le
As
dire
I
au
just
cours de cette
mentioned, over the
décennie,
course of the past few years, we have
c'est le
seen
moteur
that there is a driver behind the
multilatéral
increase in
a été
multilateral
largement
financing.
comprise.
This is due to the
On voit
response to different
ici
crises that we
les
have
crises
gone through. We can
humanitaires
see that
liées
there are
au
humanitarian
Covid,
crises, and this is linked to
Covid et plus
conflict, COVID
récemment la
crisis,
crise de
and also
l'Ukraine.
more
Si on
recently the
regarde
crisis in Ukraine. If we
ensemble
were to look at
la base
the
du financement, on
baseline, so
peut
the base of
penser que ça reste
contributions, this is
stable
dark blue. We can see that this is very
au fil des
stable
années.
across
C'est à la
the
fois une bonne
different
nouvelle
years,
puisque ça veut
which
dire que
is
le
good
système est
news. Why? Because it means that the system is
comprise,
able to
mais
respond to the different
c'est
crises
que
that it is
le
faced with.
statut
But it also shows
traditionnellement
that for more traditional
du
functions
système,
outside of
il n'y
times
a
of
pas vraiment
crisis, there
d'augmentation
isn't really that much increase of
On
resources.
voit aussi que le
We can also
système
see here that
s'adapte,
the
c'est ce qu'on avait
system,
beaucoup
and this
dit
is
dans
once again
le
something
dernier
that
PUC,
we will
qui est
continue our
une
work on. It
propagation
was something that we started looking at in our previous volume, but we can see a propagation of vertical funds and also international aid.
du
This is on
graphe
the
que vous
top
avez
side
devant
of
vous.
the
Chaque
screen
fois
that you
qu'il y a une
can
crise,
see in
donc
front of
de
you.
nouveaux fonds
As
peuvent être
soon
créés.
as there is a
Ce
new
qui
crisis,
met
a new
l'accent
fund is
sur le
created, which
système et
also
on le
puts
voit
pressure on
à
the
partir
system.
du graphe
We can see this on
de
the
nouveaux
bottom hand side of the
réformes
screen
qui
as well. We
ont
can see different
accompagné,
reforms
qui
that have
ont
taken
aidé
place, and
avec
reforms that have not always come to fruition with lots of different pledges. The funding compact, for example, of the United Nations, which is still in implementation
Sur
phase.
ce graphe, pour la première
On
fois,
this
c'est
graph here, for the first
extraordinairement
time in the report,
émergent.
we've got the different emerging countries
Auparavant, on
as
avait
well. Why?
plus
Because prior we only had the largest funders,
si on voit que les
being
pays
those OECD
émergents
member states.
prennent une
However,
place
amongst the emerging
plus
countries, we can
prépondérante
see that
dans
they're
le système. On voit
taking a
celui
higher
ici,
weighting
la
within the
Chine, qui
system,
est un
China being one of
pour lequel
them. This is one of the
le
countries
changement
for which
en termes
this
de contribution
change, or
est
the
le plus
percentage change in contribution, is the
donc
most
partant
significant.
d'une moindre
If we
contribution, on
start
voit que
from
le
a
domaine de
low
réforme
contribution, we can see that they're
qui est
making up for lost
graphique.
ground, and this in a very
Maintenant, je voulais
spectacular
juste
fashion. Now let's move
parler
on
de
to
trois
the
défis
three different
qu'on
challenges that
souligne
we are
dans le
facing and that have
rapport.
been
Le
underlined in
premier,
our
c'est
report.
celui
The
du
first
renforcement
is
de
the
la
expansion and fragmentation of
du
the
système. Et
multilateral architecture,
là,
or
on
the
voit
system, if you
sur
will.
ce
Here
graphique
on this graph,
le
we
nombre
see the number of
internationales
international
éligibles à
organizations that are
l'APD
eligible
de
for
2000 à
ODA,
2000. Et comme vous
and
voyez, il y a
the
une
evolution from
significative.
2010
On est à
up
plus de
until
200
2022. We have more
organisations
than 200
éligibles pour
organizations now that
l'APD
are ODA
aujourd'hui, y compris au sein
eligible.
même du
including within the United Nations development system, new banks, development banks, but also new vertical funds, as I mentioned earlier. This leads to many different questions from a financing point of view. Why? Because one of the models that we have, be we talking about windows or funds, we've got the IDEF for the World Bank. There are different cycles of replenishment cycles where we are looking to raise funds again, and there is more and more competition, because if we have the cycles that coincide, you've got several different institutions rather looking for those same resources at the same time. Therefore, proliferation and competition are two words that can be thrown into the mix. Once again, here we were able to introduce the question of emerging donor contributions. On the left, we see behavior of the DAC members for financing the UN systems, and also the DAC members on the left-hand, emerging donors rather, on the right-hand side. You can see that these tend to respond more to crises, be this food security crisis, migration, anything else linked to refugee crisis, and these are all financed by the DAC countries. On the emerging donors, they tend to invest more in the secretariats, in the UN Secretariat, other UN bodies, the FAO, and so on and so forth, which really begs to question what the influence of these institutions are. We saw this during the COVID crisis with the WHO and the number of donations or contributions that the WHO was receiving at the time. I will come back to this in a minute. The second challenge that is worth flagging up refers to funding quality and also the need to invest in the systems, so in the core of these institutions. Here, what we're able to see is that we have the core funding and also earmarked contributions. These earmarked in English, explains the speaker, and we can see that over the course of the past 10 years, 10 or 30% of earmarked funding, and this was about 10 years ago. And if we look at this now, it's about 50% of earmarked contributions. This is very significant because it means that we have more and more countries that decide upstream how they want to contribute or how they want to spend the money that they have available to them. We knew that this was the case when it came to the UN systems, but what we're also seeing here, and this is a new trend, is that this also has an impact on all the other institutions, including the multilateral development banks. I think that this would maybe be a point of discussion if we then talk about how this aid is allocated. Why? Because, for example, for the World Bank, we can see that this is a new phenomenon which is linked to the question of Ukraine, and this is something that didn't exist previously. We think that this has now become the exception, the rule rather than exception. If we now look at the red arrow is looking at the evolution of behavior once again for DAC members and their contribution to the systems. We can also see the fact that we're looking at the arrow that is on the right-hand side. This means that DAC members are using multilateral development systems more and more as a channel of developmental public aid. However, their contributions are lower and lower when we think about the core percentage or the total use of the multilateral system. So once again, core funding explains the speaker in French. If we move on to the next graphs now, we can see the different ratios between the baseline contributions and also earmark contributions. 10 years ago, it was a ratio that was about 2 to 1. However, now we're looking at a ratio that is 1 apiece. France before used to be a country that had a lot of baseline contributions and now is aligning with the other countries, and we can see more and more earmarked contributions that have been pre-designated. On the flip side, if this is another interesting aspect to look at, if we think about behavior of emerging countries, we can see that emerging donors maintain a larger share of core contributions in their funding mix. They have a completely different contribution attitude. Once again, they are more so looking at core contributions and less so to earmarked contributions. it maybe is a strategic decision. Maybe we've got more micromanagement for non-DAC members compared to DAC members. Perhaps DAC members have more liberty given to international donors and the way that they use the funds that are earmarked. And the last challenge that I will be raising, and that is addressed in the report that I wanted to present to you today, is the same as with each report. We change or we tweak certain focus points. In this, we wanted to look at the reforms of multilateral development banks and the financialization of the system, and the fact that this financialization comes with risks. This is when you have different financial tools, innovative financial tools that are used, but we are stretching the balance sheet. Once again, the speaker has said this in English, so stretching the balance sheet is something that we use both in French and English. What we can see on the two graphs, especially on the left-hand side of the total contributions by type of multilateral organizations, so these tend to be multilateral development banks. These have remained relatively flat over the course of the past decade. However, if we look at MDB outflows from these same banks, we can see that they keep progressing, which means that they have really stretched their leveraging capacity as far as it will go to try and disperse as much money as possible. This also shows us that the current reform drive of the system, so if we were to stretch it as far as it could go, it could, if we were talking about the World Bank or other MDBs, could support a 30% increase in MDB financing, so 30% addition to what we already have now. However, if we then look on the right-hand side of the screen, and this was in the Stern report that was published, we could see that there were calls to triple the financing capacities of the multilateral development banks, and we are still perhaps falling short. And in addition to this, this is my last slide on financialization. The financialization of the multilateral system brings with it a number of risks. What we can see, once again, this is linked to the discussion that is going to follow our presentations. The graph on the left shows us that over the course of time, we are stretching once again that leveraging capacity, and the concessional finance, or the share of concessional finance of the aid, is reducing, which means that some countries could find themselves completely excluded because we are increasing the cost of accessing credit. And this means that some countries could find themselves excluded. And on the flip side, this is on the right-hand side now of the screen, this is a sector, certain sectors have found themselves forgotten, education being one of them. There was a multilateral finance for education that had dropped by 30% between 2021 and 2022. Why? Because funds are being allocated more to infrastructure, especially for middle income countries, and these social aspects or education have been forgotten. Just to conclude, and I'm going to be very quick in this, so we've got a couple of solutions to put forward. We can look at maximizing contributions to high impact funding mechanisms. This would be the first. We can also look at smaller funds that don't have a good leverage effect. So should we be looking more at the World Bank or big institutions, or should we be pulling together even smaller institutions? The second is, how do we safeguard the system's capacity to support the poorest and the most vulnerable? Once again, we can see that financialization has a negative effect on this, and therefore we need to associate an increase of capital with financialization, be this from IDA or others, in order to ensure that there are mechanisms or windows rather that are linked to this. We also want to look at ensuring adequate financing or funding for core strategic functions, not only for earmarked funding, but also how do we invest in the system. This is really the raison d'etre of the system. This is the rationale behind the system. We don't just want to replace bilateral actions that take place. The fourth is effectiveness at scale through better coordination and coherence. Once again, this is something that we had spoken about the last time with Patrick and FERDI. looking at the framework that was created in order to increase the standards and better coordinate bilateral meetings. But today, with the increase in the number of actors and the fact that we've got half of the allocation of aid that comes through these actors means that we have issues linked to effectiveness and also coordination. My last point is engage with emerging donors on multilateral development finance. Why? Because we can see that there are different behaviors out there and that it would be important for us to have better governance of the system. That's it for me. Just to conclude, we've got the report that is available online. It is also available in an abridged format in French as well as English. There is a webpage that you can see on the screen that is dedicated to multilateral development finance. This week, we've got the Multilateral Development Finance Week with all the different events that I mentioned. We also have 2 dashboards available. We've got an interactive dashboard that you're able to use for your research on the use of multilateral systems, and this for the DAC members. And we've also got a DAC members earmarked funding to multilateral organizations. Thank you very much, and I will stop now. Thank you, Patrick, and the rest of you for listening to me.
Merci beaucoup, Olivier. Cette
Thank you, Olivier. This presentation is incredibly rich, and we do want to read the entire report now and see all the details, because what we see in your presentation is a trend over the past decade, but also a specific trend for the year 2022. And it's very difficult to understand what we have to base our analysis on the year 2022 or on the past decades. And this question is actually mentioned in the report and tackled. And you also mentioned this huge difference between earmark contributions and core contributions, because in 2022 there was a huge change noticed. And then there's the question of innovations. On the graphs, we can see that there are lots of many new entities. We respond to crisis by creating new entities, and we don't necessarily increase the funds given to existing organizations, and maybe that will be mentioned later on. But we even notice that there's been a decrease in the means awarded to core funds. And then you also mentioned emerging donor countries who don't necessarily have the same strategy as existing stakeholders, and their impact, of course, depends on their relative share. So, of course, on your graph, we can see that there's a huge impact made by these emerging donors, but what's the share of the funds allocated? That's another question up for debate later on, and maybe Olivier will be able to tell us more about all this. Before I give the floor to our next panelist, I'd like to maybe mention something else about this report. If I may, there's something that was quite forbidden by this report, the issue of allocation, an issue that was mentioned by Olivier in the very last graphs in the presentation. And I'm talking about the share of concessional funds in the total funds. This is a matter that's important to us at FERDI, but it's also a very political matter. Concessional funds are a more and more important matter. And there is a deception from the global south. For example, there was a summit in Paris for vulnerable and poor countries, but vulnerable was in the name of this summit. And how do we define and appreciate this vulnerability? And that is one of the questions that the report did not tackle, that was quite forbidden by the report. And here at FERDI, we started to work on that very issue of vulnerability. And very recently, we have studied the question of accountability when it comes to the reduction of vulnerability and how we reach our goals. And when we take a look at the average degree of vulnerability of recipient countries in bilateral aid, it's, I think, more or less identical to that of multilateral aid. And I have a slide about this. Thank you very much, Fabienne. So when it comes to the allocation of flows, here we've got a table with our indicators. And we could see that when we take the MVI as an index, so the multidimensional vulnerability index, it is identical more or less when it comes to bilateral and multilateral aid. But if we take a look at this average index, it is actually higher for IDA and the ADF than for the UNDP, but they're quite the same, but they are much higher in the indicator than the EU, which is actually quite paradoxical because the EU does take into account vulnerability in its allocation formula. If we take a look at the elasticity function compared to the vulnerability indicator or based on it, we notice that, again, there's no real difference between bilateral and multilateral aid. But when it comes to the EU and the UNDP, elasticity is quite significant. But it's not the case with IDA and the AFD. So there is a difference in the response to vulnerability by these institutions. And it is related to the windows. They're more open to vulnerability for the EU. And other multilateral banks, for example, have a threshold that's different than that of the EU, and they take vulnerability into account differently. But we can see there's more elasticity and differentiation when it comes to the UNDP and the EU. And this differentiation does not exist with the other institutions studied, which is a problem. And Abdoul Salam Bello can tell us more about this issue later on, because we do believe that we need a vulnerability aspect and even vulnerability indicator within the allocation formulas. We really need to look at this vulnerability index and not only at income when it comes to allocating resources for a country. So that's what I wanted to highlight about your report, because the report is very good, but I think the OECD needs to take this matter into account, and we're actually ready to share our tool with the OECD. We actually created that tool, that vulnerability tool, and we're absolutely ready to share it. So thank you very much. And I'm now going to give the floor first to Hary Ralarosy. If you'd like to take the floor, Hary. And then Lisa will have the floor, and then Abdoul Salam Bello will speak last. Hary, please, you have the floor. Hary, are you with us? we may have lost connection with Hary, so maybe we'll give the floor to Lisa in that case. That's fine by me. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm glad to be part of this panel, and I'm glad to discuss this report by the OECD on multilateral aid. It was a very good read, and I did learn a lot from it, especially when it comes to these three huge changes that our multilateral system is undergoing. So financialization of the system, which is leading to less concessional funds, and therefore another impact and consequences on the fight against poverty. Then there are emerging players in this field, and I was very glad to see that graphs about the types of investments in organizations, especially I liked seeing the difference between the contributions made by traditional donors and those made by emerging donors, and especially in terms of soft power. That's very interesting. And then I was very interested by this aspect of increasing earmark contributions with more visibility to these earmarked contributions in the activities of the organizations. And you did mention that this is motivated by crisis, because most of the time these earmarked contributions are created in response to crisis, and they do have a very huge impact on the lasting effects of development institutions. So these three structural changes, these trends, have been studied by scientific studies as well and academia. We noticed that there have been serious and less serious studies, especially on the topic of financialization, which is actually one of the topics that have been the least studied. And I think it's a shame and a shortcoming in our profession, in our field. But again, it's something that has been on the rise recently. But it is an opportunity for the system, but it's also an opportunity that has lots of risks. An opportunity, why? Because it gives access to more funds, and because we're trying to limit spending. It can be a very good tool, but of course it has many risks. For example, risk for the poorest country and for concessional funds, as you've mentioned. And there is little research, very little research on that aspect. We don't really know what's the relation between financialization of the system and concessional funds. I don't think there's enough research on that aspect. There's not enough quantitative data. And when it comes to the link between financialization and funding modalities, so concessional funds or not. So I think that's something that needs to be explored a lot more by research. Now, you've also touched upon new emerging donors. And again, it's a good opportunity that conveys risks. And what's at stake could be even more complicated maybe than the risk conveyed by financialization. Now, you said it, we need to reinforce the rationalization of procedures and processes, because there are many players in the system that leads to more transaction costs, more harmonization, streamlining costs, There are sector priorities as well that can be involved. And you've also mentioned the question of soft power in institutions. So I think the report did a very good job in covering these aspects. But more generally speaking, the emergence of these new donors also influences or creates some sort of competition between donors. And the balance of power is also changed by way of consequence. So we also need to study this balance of power a lot more. And we need to study the change in the system and the landscape in general. You also mentioned this increasing risk of aid fragmentation, but we also need to mention the debt issue, because if there are more emerging donors, then that leads to questions about debt cancellment or debt repayment, and this leads to many other issues when it comes to debt. Now, when it comes to some emerging donors, such as China, for example, there is scientific literature. India, Brazil, or other emerging donors. But we do have studies on China, and we've got a mixed picture of the impact of Chinese aid. There's a positive impact when it comes to massive investment in infrastructure. It is contributing to growth, but the impact is less positive when it comes to the labor market, risks of corruption, and there's also a political economy that's complicated with the governments of partner countries. So when it comes to these emerging donors, we do know a little bit more about this phenomenon, scientifically speaking, than when it comes to financialization. And we do understand that this situation can get complicated. Now, you've mentioned a third aspect, earmarked funds. Once again, there could be opportunities, for example, more money, but more money question mark, really, because it depends whether earmarked funds can come in addition to core funding. But if they start acting as substitutes, and it's too early to say if it's the case, but if they come as substitute, the situation can be more complicated. So the situation is not as clear. We could also think that because these funds are created to respond to crisis, they could have a positive impact. But there are studies that show that using earmarked funds to manage crisis can actually make crisis response lag behind. So once again, it's a mixed picture we get. Now, researchers have studied the issue and realized that in terms of performance and impact on development, as well as in terms of the efficacy or the organizations, there could be a negative impact. I'm thinking of Bernard Hinsberg and his co-authors. Earmarked funds, according to them, are actually distorting aid in that these funds respond to the personal interests of countries. They tend to favor countries with whom they have partnerships and trade relations. And their studies have also showed that this aid goes to short-term projects, and this leads to less quality as well. And then there are also studies that show that earmarked funds involve more reporting, more fundraising, and involve more human resources and more support functions. And that is a cost for organizations, and that hinders the organization of the institution. So from that scientific literature, I think the diagnosis is quite negative when it comes to these earmarked funds. So there are three big changes to conclude, three big changes affecting multilateral institutions. And the organizations are either taking part very actively, but sometimes they're also powerless. We seem to observe that they're quite active in that change, and we need more studies to see the impact that these changes have. Now, when it comes to the room for maneuver to deal with these changes, we don't really know much about these room for maneuver. I think it's an exogenous factor that these organizations need to adapt, and that's how I wanted to conclude today. We really need to study their rooms for maneuver if these institutions want to create good practices that could help them collect all the benefits, all the good impacts of these big changes without being exposed to the risks conveyed by these changes. Thank you very much for your attention.
Lisa, de ces remarques.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for your very relevant remarks and comments that lead us to ask many questions. I'm not sure if we're going to have the answers right now, and I think that Olivier gave us a few elements of answers in his presentation, and even though we do agree that we need more research for our community. But that all said, and if I may, the report actually says this. I'm not sure if Olivier mentioned this in his presentation, but it isn't something that I've invented. It's something that I pulled out of the report. Absolutely. I think that the idea behind the report was also to whet your appetite so that we can go one step further in our thinking and in our research. Absolutely. So Hary is back with us. We lost you momentarily earlier, which is why we decided to switch things up a little bit and give the floor to Elizabeth. Hary, can you hear us? Yes, I can hear you very well, Patrick. Good evening, everyone. You have the floor. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for having invited me to take part in this webinar. I will start my presentation without further ado. I want to speak about, historically speaking, and the origins of official development aid, which can be traced back to a historical speech given by Harry Truman, who at the time was President of the United States. He gave a speech in 1949. In his speech, he emphasized a bold program that was necessary in order to improve growth in underdeveloped countries, given that at the time, half of the world's population was living in extreme poverty. This was a post-war context, and therefore we had the concept of development aid, which came to be. And the main objective of eradicating poverty would celebrate its 75th anniversary this year. And we've come a long way. If we just imagine the context of the speech in 1949, and then we had lots of different events which took place. But what is the assessment that we can make of the past 75 years? It is true that from the time of its creation, we've got the expectations and the objectives that have changed, be we talking about the donors, but also the beneficiaries. The world has faced many shocks, and the intensity and the frequency of which are unpredictable, with sometimes disastrous consequences that tend to be long-lasting. During the various international summits, we often hear about the efforts deployed by donors in order to increase the amounts of aid allocated, particularly in the wake of the COVID crisis in 2020. Statistics show that a record $211 billion was paid out by rich donor countries when the war broke out in Ukraine. And this is a record figure. As a representative of a beneficiary country, I would like to reopen the debate on the effectiveness of aid allocation in relation to their impact, in relation to their experience, particularly in fragile and vulnerable countries, including Madagascar. In particular, Africa has remained on the sidelines amongst the beneficiaries, notwithstanding the increase in the envelope. The challenge of eradicating poverty remains unresolved. The concept of vulnerability provides greater structure and clarity with indicators that are measurable, integrated, and accepted. This progress in research on the vulnerability indicator will allow us to improve the achievement of objectives and therefore to consolidate the effectiveness of development aid. My talk will be divided into 3 parts now. I will begin by sharing my experiences as a citizen of a vulnerable country, a beneficiary country receiving development aid. Then I'll look at the dangers and consequences of a lack of awareness of these changes in vulnerability. And finally, the last part of my presentation will be devoted to the importance of multilateralism as an essential solution in order to reduce vulnerability and the danger of populism. In the report entitled Measuring the Various Forms of Vulnerability to Assess its Impact, a new conceptual framework applied to Madagascar, written by Patrick Guillaumont, Sylvain Guillaumont, and Laurent Wagner, which highlighted the various forms of vulnerability, as well as Madagascar's vulnerability profile. The report highlighted the low level of net ODA received by Madagascar, and this despite the progress and the efforts made since its re-engagement with the international financial community. The overall observation in the fields is that when we speak about countries such as Madagascar, like so many other countries on the African continent, we speak about fragility, vulnerability, and poverty, and these are the words that are most referenced. With the multiplication of shocks and crises, be we talking about internal or external, everything is becoming more urgent. Food security strongly correlated with climate change, social unrest against the rising cost of living, growing insecurity, even in the major urban centers, which are part and parcel of daily life. At the same time, governments must not lose sight of what is at stake in the development of human capital and infrastructure, which must henceforth take account of their adaptation to climate change, their resistance to natural disasters, which are very common in Madagascar and thus strengthen their resilience. In short, the challenges are enormous in the face of very limited resources. Second part now, we see a world phenomena which is not lost on anyone, and this is the inexorable rise of populism and the rejection of globalization, the trend towards fragmentation, and even the increasing use of protectionism We have debates and analyses in an attempt to understand this phenomenon, which is spreading in both Western countries as well as developing countries. Taken to the extreme, populism is a danger that concerns us all. Pending the results of scientific research, it is highly likely that vulnerability is both a cause and a consequence of this phenomena. For developing countries, growing inequality and the failure to satisfy basic needs encourage citizens caught up in the confusion to allow themselves to be seduced by rhetoric rejecting diversity and the benefits of social community life. In addition, populism also changes national policy priorities, which do not necessarily correspond to development needs and therefore decreasing vulnerability. Aid beneficiaries, when found in a situation of increased vulnerability and financial need, are sometimes forced to accommodate the political intentions as well as the priorities of certain donors. The result can be an accumulation of debt without any reduction in vulnerability. It is within this context that multilateralism takes on its full meaning, unlike bilateral aid, which is more so aligned with the donor's priorities. We should therefore work together in order to give a new impetus to multilateralism in order to reduce vulnerability. I can only underline the words of those who are calling for an acceleration of the reform of the international financial architecture. The various proposals for ways of strengthening the resources of multilateral development financing should be considered. Examples have been given: taxing financial transactions, taxing super polluters, given the scale of the needs. A growing call for debt solutions and debt cancellation for vulnerable countries is to be underlined, especially in the event of shocks. In this respect, increased concessional financing will improve the viability of vulnerable countries. Furthermore, greater consideration of vulnerability criteria in allocating aid will have a greater impact in enhancing aid effectiveness. We've also noted that commitments have been made in order to make aid conditionalities more flexible. Beneficiary countries are waiting and also hopeful for concrete progress. And to conclude, I will be talking about the beneficiary countries, including the role that we have to play in developing national policy, as well as choosing priorities to reduce vulnerability and build resilience. The beneficiaries will contribute to the adoption of the vulnerability index by ensuring that the concepts are properly appropriated and used in negotiations. It is important to include, and this as a priority for beneficiary countries, mobilization of local resources through the development of the capital market, as well as giving more space to the development of a private sector that leads to job creation. Another key element is informing citizens, particularly about prioritization, the terms and conditions of loans and financing, the consequences for debt sustainability, amongst others. A strong political will be the essential ingredient if we are to achieve our common objectives. On this note, I would like to thank you for listening to me. Thank you. Thank you very much, Hary, for your speech. it really hit home with regards to the different expectations that a poor and vulnerable country such as Madagascar may have with regards to multilateral cooperation and the role that we have to play in this domain as well, notably when we're looking at reducing and eradicating poverty, as you mentioned earlier. I also have heard or have understood the role that multilateral cooperation can play, more specifically in financing public goods. We need more coordination on the global stage if we are looking to meet our objectives. This is a wonderful segue now to our friend Abdoul Salam, Bello is Executive Director of the Africa Group 2 at the World Bank Group. 23 countries, 23 African countries, most of them being French-speaking, some Portuguese-speaking, convene within the Africa Group 2 in order to discuss the relevant issues for the African continent. Abdoul Salam Bello, as I mentioned, is the executive director, and he had the privilege or the opportunity to organize the General Assembly in Marrakesh. And we were talking about how to undertake or how to take on the question of allocation of aid to underprivileged countries. And it's very important for me to hear how one of the biggest, if not the biggest financial body in the world, takes on this issue, especially if we think about the fact that the group is made up of some of the poorest and most vulnerable countries in the world. Abdul Salam, thank you very much for being here, and you have the floor. Thank you very much, Professor. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here and to be partaking in this panel on such an important issue. I would also like to thank Patrick and all of the FERDI teams for everything that they have done and the support that they provide to us in these different discussions that we have as administrators on the African continent. We, as I mentioned, have the board of directors bringing together 23 countries. Just prior to starting, I just want to share a couple of elements of language. Obviously, I am not here to as a spokesperson of the World Bank. I want to share our perspective as an African board member on the subject and how we envisage in our discussions and our reflections the way that we can undertake this problem. I really appreciate the different speeches that have been given by the representatives, not only from Madagascar, but and in fact, Madagascar is one of the countries that make up the Africa group. I also enjoyed listening to Lisa Chauvet as well as Olivier Cattaneo. So if I think about Olivier Cattaneo, I appreciated reading the reports as well, but I also want to say that I have worked a lot with the 2022 report, and shamelessly so, if I may say. I saw that there were three different tensions that international or multilateral development banks are facing: identity tests, legitimacy tests, and also capacity tests. And these three tests, if you want, have actually helped me a lot of my advocacy work within the group and also helped the evolution of the group within the World Bank. And I wanted to just share this with you. Maybe this can be my baseline for the rest of my presentation. When we started the negotiations on bank reforms, for us, there were these three different themes that were very important for us with identity. So what are we hoping to get out of this? What are international development banks, including the World Bank, looking to ascertain from this? Development banks, climate financing, and there are lots of different adjectives as well that can be associated to this. What we also were saying is that when we look at the framework for the different countries that tend to be considered as fragile or vulnerable, especially when there are conflicts, or also everything linked to climate vulnerability, we saw that there was a different dimension from an identity point of view that we really needed to bring to the table. As the World Bank said, we are an international bank that is building for development. When we think about the multiplication of conflicts that we've seen, we are in the era of construction. We need to rebuild following all of these conflicts. Therefore, the question is, how do we build? How do we find solutions or answers to the different conflicts that we're currently facing? We've also got legitimacy rather, especially when we think about geopolitical issues. But going above and beyond just geopolitical issues, we spoke about China earlier, but it's not just China. It's also about how countries in developing countries find themselves around the table and how do we ensure that they are going to be represented, but also their voice. And from the IMF, we've got other administrators that are available for Africa, but we also think that these are different steps that need to be taken if and should be explored if we want to reach our objectives. And this following the summit of financial architecture that took place and organized by the French government last year. Naturally, the question of capacity comes into play here, and this is a question that is fundamental. Revenue. This is a question rather that has been brought up in lots of different discussions this morning. From an African perspective, we are a continent, and this is true. This is a young continent. We've got a median age of 19 or 20 years old. From a leverage point of view, unfortunately, we see that we don't have the same leverage capacity. There is a decrease in investment in the education sector, even though if we look about at the youth and the African youth, this is the domain where we want the most substantive investment. Why? Because if we invest in education, it's different from just building roadways, which obviously is important as well. But it's if you invest in education, it's a lot different from just building a bridge. Why? Because it is permanent investment. It's not just about building the bridge and then you're done with it. It's about continuous investment. This dimension is very important and stays very important. We've also got the question of costs, loans, of financial aid. In addition to this, we spoke about this earlier. We spoke about IDA rather, and we wanted to talk about three different things from a reform perspective. We said speed, scale, and impact. Speed, scale, and impact once again. And this comes back to different subjects that were mentioned earlier by Olivier and Lisa. Obviously, we have the international development banks, but we also have new actors on the stage, especially from the bilateral point of view. And I spoke about demographics in Africa, but this also shows fragility and development and others. This comes back to this asks the question of whether we can go faster for education and health. And we've got other issues as well, especially when we have a population in 2030. You can say that African youth is going to represent 40% of global youth. We know this. I think that this isn't dealt with. It's going to become a challenge. I don't have any other words in French, unfortunately, to express this. Or the question of response or rapidity in this framework is fundamental, and we've spoken about additionality. I would always also say that additionality is part of quality, partnership, capacity of how we absorb things. And when we talk about capacity of absorption, the speed at which we are able to implement, but this is also something that was very well illustrated in the presentations that were given earlier. Obviously, when do we ensure that we are not adding complexity, and how do we multiply this, or how do we ensure that we're not having a negative impact on each of the institutions and the beneficiary countries, all while knowing that the developing countries in their own right, their institutions are institutions that are developing countries. So the question of capacity in terms of existence is important, and this depends on the quality of the staff that are negotiating. But you have to multiply if we're multiplying actors and stakeholders, and from the environmental parts of things, from this, you're also going to increase the risks or complexity and delays and so on and so forth.
Les acteurs, du coup, je suis peut-être subjectif étant
So when it comes to more players may maybe when you look at the comparative advantage that it conveys for development banks, there's more volume involved, but also a multiplicity of instruments and tools that these institutions can work on. We talked about the IDA. We are replenishing the IDA for December of this year. The IDA has a huge leverage effect with huge funds, but we've got also this window for private funding and all the questions of funding in local currencies, which answers a lot of the concerns about concessionality and risks involved when you change currencies. That could allow for more local investments with concessional rates and also on the long run. Access to loans in many countries is very expensive. Having access to the capital market can also be very difficult, very complex, but the very architecture of new players makes over indebtedness possible as well. So that's a risk. Now, within the framework of the G20, we've been mentioning the fact that the model, the architecture is changing. So we have to reinforce the mobilization of resources through instruments and mechanisms like the IDA. But on the other hand, we're also saying, and I think that our authorities in Marrakesh last year during the meeting and the assembly of the fund and the bank said it very well, there is simplification involved. How do we reduce all the difficulties and links in policies, commitments? How do we add more flexibility in the processes, and how do we act swiftly? And the logic of it all is still the same, the one I mentioned, with speed and scale and impact. Now, we haven't had a proper definition on global public goods. We've used global challenges instead in terms of terminology, but this question remains important. There is competition with the resources allocated. When it comes to vertical funds, they are focused on one topic in particular, but these funds are particularly earmarked and not flexible. So developing countries see their capacity reduced when it comes to use the funds to deal with development needs, and when it comes to meeting the needs of their population. And maybe that's the elephant in the room, but there are vertical funds that are already existing and some that are coming. And the question now is, how do we ensure flexibility and interoperability between all these mechanisms? If there's good interoperability between these mechanisms, why not? But we've also had sort of negative experiences before when it comes to access to vertical funds. I'm not going to give names, but you may know what I'm talking about. Hary mentioned it before. She said we need to look at the perception of the citizens and how they feel, how the population feel about these funds and about development in the countries represented. And what she said is actually important, the perception, the way they feel about representation and access to resources and on the implementation of these projects based on the resources. Representation and efficacy are two important elements. There are also issues on appropriation, and we've noticed that on different projects and programs. How do we make sure that institutions align their programs and combine their programs and make sure that they're aligned with all multilateral and bilateral actions? There is a question to be tackled here. How do we make sure that institutions support the implementation of development programs on the national scale? If they don't align, then we end up in a scenario where we have to act within a framework and we are limited within that framework. There are many cases in which we tell countries that they have issues with their absorption capacity. But it's also a challenge for development institutions. They need to lead these projects better, and sometimes we only see one side of the issue and not the other. When it comes to financialization, I think it was a good point to raise. As part of the discussions I participated to that was raised, now there are ratios that can be studied, equity to loan. They could be lower, but that's what Lisa said. There are financial opportunities for organizations, but there are risks involved as well. These costs could end up being a burden for recipient countries. So we need to find the right balance. We can think of financialization as a good tool, sure, but at what cost and how? Again, it's a question of perception and feeling. Access to banks can be made more difficult as a result to countries. And when this happens, countries turn to other players, and they do so according to their strategic, economic, and political interests. So I think that's a number of elements that we need to take into account. Again, there's a question of concessionality, but when it comes to the architecture, how do we better integrate the question of vulnerability? We have heard a panel with the Vice President of the African Bank of Development and the General Secretary of the least advanced countries and SIDS and the Minister of Finance of Comoros at the time. And why am I mentioning Comoros? Well, because a few days ago we talked about this in New York. If you take basic allocation given to a country like Comoros and you see the costs of the cyclone, it's up to $190 million. So think of the basic core allocation to Comoros and think of the impact of that cyclone. Well, it's actually twice the core allocation on 3 years. That's because of one disaster, one natural disaster. So of course, now we need to think of the identity of our development partner and what's their capacity, because capacity, legitimacy, and identity are the 3 elements taken into account. And if we fail a country based on one of these 3 elements, then what happens then? So I think these are all the elements we need to take into account when facing the current scenario, economically, financially, politically. And I think I'll conclude here. I hope I did cover all the elements that I wanted to cover and that were mentioned earlier by my fellow panelists. I think it's an important discussion. I think we need to keep on discussing these aspects for the multilateral institutions. And if we do want to carry out a reform, and if we do want to take into account the MVI, then the question is, how do we help the multilateral development finance institution integrate and use this tool to the best? Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this presentation, Abdoul Salam, for this very detailed and rich presentation. It was full of details and experiences. So thank you very much. But we do have questions for from the audience now. So they want your answers. And I have questions here that I can ask you panelists. I'll take 2 or 3 questions so that the members of the panels can answer them. The last question is a question about this trade-off between crowdfunding and earmarked funds. With this big change in 2022 and how multilateral aid can, or rather how multilateral institution can do this trade-off. So there's this first question about the trade-off between crowdfunding and earmarked funds. There's another question as well here in the chat. A question about the financialization of multilateral banks and how to ensure that this financialization doesn't occur at the expense of concessional funds. Do we need to keep the share of concessional funds as it is? Or how do we go about it? Isn't what matters the absolute value of concessional funds, and isn't the question how to make it increase and how to protect them from financialization? And then there are other questions about the impact of multilateral finance based on bilateral development finance. It's interesting because I remember drafting a paper on coordination, and I remember the title was Coordinating the Coordinators, and it was about this very topic, and coordination is very difficult. It requires a lot of organization and coordination, but there's also coordination to be considered in accountability. And this accountability, is it a question to leave up to the OECD or the United Nations? There will be an event soon on this very topic, but I'd like to hear your comments or reactions on these three questions. So first, crowdfunding versus earmarked funds, then second question, financialization and concessional funds, and then third, coordination between bilateral and multilateral institutions. So who would like to take the floor and answer one or several of these questions? Abdoul, Salam, you have the floor. Well, I asked questions in conclusion of my presentations, and so I'd like to provide answers now. The question of financialization and concessional funds is something I wanted to say more about during my presentation, but I didn't have quite the time. So what brings development banks to move to finance, innovation, and financialization? Well, that's what was said in Olivier's presentation. There's innovation because there hasn't been any further contribution by donor countries. It's remained flat. And the multilateral institutions involved need to find the resources to provide the outflows. So this question is very interesting. If we want concessionality to keep functioning, then we need more resources, more budgets. But there are more crises, and we need to keep on funding traditional players. But we've seen that the inflows are stagnating. So how can banks do something to deal with that situation? Well, financialization. But of course, there's a cost involved, especially when it comes to access by some countries. Now, of course, when it comes to another question you asked, and the fact that there are many institutions to coordinate, well, yes, there's a need for more coordination whenever there's more players involved. From my point of view, I would take things the other way around. We need to evaluate the capacity of institutions to respond to development needs on specific topics so that governments who benefit from multilateral, bilateral aid can understand better the results of their partnerships. Afterward, they can optimize and improve the quality of their relations. And I've seen countries carry out this type of analysis because these countries have the capacities to carry out this type of analysis, impact analysis. So I've understood what you said, and instead of creating an institution to coordinate it all, I think maybe impact analysis, impact assessment is a good way to go. Then maybe some regional institutions could take a look at the question of costs at regional and sub-regional levels. They could take a look at partnerships with development banks. These institutions work with development banks, so why could they not further their partnership in that aspect? And then the third question was about this trade-off, but I think I'll give the floor to somebody else on that. The clock is ticking right now. and I'm going to give the floor to other panelists. I'll give the floor to
We've got different listeners.
representatives of the Global North and the Global South. Pierre Duquesne, a former colleague of yours, who was also an ambassador at the OECD. And then Pierre Duquesne will then take the floor for 2 minutes. We'll be happy to hear your point of view. And when it comes to the Global South, as I said, we've got a representative, Edwidge Murray, who will be happy to give us some input. It will be very interesting to us. So please give the floor to Pierre Duquesne.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, we can. We can hear you very well. Pierre, if you can be brief and concise. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you to all of the different speakers. It was very interesting, and you have just... I think that I am maybe the only person in the world who has never been an ambassador to the OECD. And I think that this says a lot to the dysfunctionment in the world. Why? Because I think that if we were to look at the others, the finance banks, even ministers of development, at the OECD, we don't have that same status. So it starts in, I think there's a lack of coordination in the Western world. I wanted to share my experience, and I have maybe 3 questions apart from the African board member. Nobody spoke about climate change and climate financing. We know that this is important. No one spoke about immigration. And once again, I just wanted to know whether this had an impact or not. But maybe we can think about the different national parliaments and the roles that they have, especially in donor countries. The fact that we've got earmarked funding that is asked for, they're asking for more bilateral than multilateral funding. This is easy to explain. I think that there's a lot of sexism. People are skeptic rather, and we see different trends that lend themselves to this theory. I would also like to finish, and maybe this is the last question, but that's a lot of questions. If I have understood, the OECD wants to open its framework to international organizations. For me, this is a wonderful idea, and I'm convinced that the different donors are not ready. I'm not talking about France, but others. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pierre. We have someone else who has asked for the floor, Christine, and I can see that there are 3 very important questions. One on the role of the major importance of bilateral and multilateral communication. This wasn't mentioned, but it's between core funding. Maybe Olivier, you could take the floor and talk about this. I know that Olivier knows exactly what's going on. Climate wasn't mentioned, but it was there. And then the second question was linked to bilateral and multilateral. We saw this in the statistics that were presented by Olivier in 2022. We saw a complete inverse of the trends. We saw that there was a decrease of bilateral and also a complete change in 2022. And I think that this actually corresponds to a new trend that we are seeing. And it would be interesting for us to have the viewpoint of Olivier Cattaneo on this point and the others. Patrick, I'm sorry, we've also got Christian who is with us, so I could maybe give Christian the floor as well. But very quickly, as we don't have a lot of time, and I thought that she had left, so I decided that I would continue for a little bit longer. Christian, if you can take the floor very, very quickly, because we are running out of time. 1 minute, no more. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Professor. Thank you for having accepted me. Maybe 2 minutes, if I may take a little bit more time for from what I've understood from my experience with our countries. Sometimes there is a low capacity to absorb funds, so we often have funds that are allocated, but the countries are unable to use these funds. We have different projects that are funded, but 50% of the financing is not used. Therefore, we are currently trying to proceed to different areas that we can recover the funds that haven't been used, even though they're really needed. Therefore, what I want to say is how can we strengthen or how can we look at capacity building for our beneficiaries so that they can better absorb funds? And what about sometimes funds that are allocated do not correspond to the needs of the beneficiaries? And we spoke about accountability. Accountability is also something that we should be looking at with our beneficiaries. There are my 2 minutes, and I believe they're up. Thank you very much. So I want to come back to the subject of our panel. If we look at the capacity for absorption and we're more looking at bilateral or multilateral, we would need to look at the commitment from both stances, and perhaps we could think about this gap and why this gap exists. We know that the European Union has mentioned this, and perhaps it's an issue linked to the structure behind bilateral and multilateral cooperation. Maybe multilateral allows for a better organization. Olivier, are you able to answer some of these questions for us? Yes, absolutely. There are loads of questions. I wasn't able to take notes, but thank you very much. That really shows how much everyone has been listening to us. And just to underline a point that was mentioned right at the beginning, one of the objectives of our report was to drum up interest for further research. And I would encourage you all to conduct further research, because this can help us in all of the different institutions. We were talking about the World Bank, the OECD is very useful. I'm going to start with the last question, the question on climate. The question on climate. And there is an increase
qui sont affectés au climat ou pour lesquels les membres disent qu'ils ont un impact sur le climat, mais en même temps, on ne voit pas
we don't really have any additionality here that we see.
question de savoir, est-ce que c'est une relabellisation?
Is it a relabeling?
Par exemple, je sais pas, le métro de Mumbai qui tout d'un
Of maybe the metro in Mumbai that is becoming clean transport, a clean transport project, whereas before it was just an urban transport project. What we're not seeing here, and when we look at the different figures, is that it's not the climate crisis that is looking at the increase. It was COVID, it was Ukraine, and that doesn't mean that in Ukraine there isn't a climate dimension. There is a climate dimension everywhere. This is an issue when it comes to statistics, and this is one of the discussions. If I think about Baku and the new objective that we have for climate rather, because there are different figures that we're seeing between what is really public aid and climate and the different commitments that have been pledged. and there is a lot of confusion. But I would encourage you to look at research so that you can see what this is all about, if there was really additionality or if it's just as relabeling something with a more climate label. We've got migration as well. That's very important. And just to say that I don't know if you know this yet, but the rapporteur, the new rapporteur for the finance conditions in France for development, is someone that comes from the right-wing party Rassemblement National. So in France, this is going to be an issue that is going to be really looked at, and that we will need to keep a close eye on in order to really have an eye on the development dimension. And I am just going to pick up on what was said prior. I think it's essential to underline the fact that parliaments will also be deciding on what is allocated and the help that is allocated. And when we talk about coordination, how coordinators and all of the different reforms of architecture, of aid, we have a tendency to say, okay, everything's going to be done by the United Nations because it's universal. But if we move more and more away from the United Nations, and if we're moving away from those who are contributing to cooperation and development, is this something that is not then going to come back and haunt us? So what do we do in order to ensure that we do strike that balance between the different national considerations and international global considerations? And that was one of the other questions that was mentioned. We've also got the foreign affairs ministers and the different global treasuries, where we have completely different perspectives that need to be reconciled. One of the things that maybe it would be interesting for Washington to have a look at what's going on in New York. That would be a suggestion that I could make, so that we're able to establish this. I've just got two very quick points on vulnerability. Vulnerability, why? Because we haven't spoken about this, but just to say that this is something that we are also looking at, especially because the World Bank was part of the organizations that had the biggest focus on poverty. The question of the fact that there was more and more earmarked funds within the World Bank, does this not mean that we will then have to rethink the leadership under the World Bank and the question of poverty as to the benefit of other questions? But this is something that once again we need to explore, and all of this to say that we're not going to wait for the next report to come out, Patrick, to speak about NVI and vulnerability, because from tomorrow morning we have the first meeting for the new working party on this framework to look at the revision of the graduation and the list of countries that are eligible to ODA, and how we're going to look at the different vulnerability indexes to better allocate aid in the preparation phase once the list has come out. So this is something that we're working on tomorrow. And we also have contact with FERDI for our different studies on the subject. And for financialization, just very quickly, reaction, this is something that was linked to the complexity, and what we would like to establish here is a system where we can strengthen technical assistance and also capacity building. We want to create a platform where all of the different requests coming in can also be seen by all of the members of the framework, so that we can have a system where we can respond in a more systematic fashion. And we're also working on how to better look at this. So looking to create complexity, and this has also been said, and this can benefit other donors, and they're taking too much space. So these are all different things that we're working on in the preparation. And once again, I can't really go into all of the questions that were asked because we don't have enough time, but it's I have so much to say about all of the other things as well, but I will stop now.
Merci beaucoup, Olivier.
Thank you so much, Olivier, for these answers. You're beginning to answer the questions, really, but it's already quite deep and detailed. Now, we've gone over time already, but I'd like to maybe comment Olivier's comment. First of all, thank you for your comment on green funds. We've been working a lot on this issue at FERDI, and we're planning an event on this very issue. And I think you gave a perfect example of what we want to talk about. I think it's a very complex issue. And if we want to reach an international agreement on green financial flows, I think it will be difficult, but we need to do so. There's a need for transparency, and we can't talk about additionality if we don't tackle this very issue you've mentioned. Second, and I've forgotten what I wanted to say. It was an important point I wanted to raise. So tomorrow, the DAC will be meeting to talk about how to change the DAC doctrine on eligibility to ODA. And I think it shows how important this issue is and how important the research how important looking for the right vulnerability tool or index is. Now, access to concessional funds is not only an issue of eligibility. I think it's also about allocation. I think we don't want to think in boxes, and we don't want to put countries in categories based on their vulnerabilities only, but we need to think of their vulnerabilities also. I don't want to say too much here, and I'd like to ask Hary and Lisa if they have something to say as a way of conclusion, or if they want to add something to what has just been said. Hary, you have the floor. Thank you, Patrick. Yes, I do agree with you. We cannot generalize all vulnerable countries. They're all different. They can't be put in boxes. And I wanted to add that there are more and more earmarked contributions and less crowdfunding. So less and less funds allocated to fighting poverty. And I think this is why finding an indicator that will allow for better allocation is so important. Recipient countries also need to integrate and fully use these new indicators for policy-making purposes and to improve their capacities. Thank you, Hary. By the way, I'm so sorry we don't have the time to give the floor to people in the audience, but we can keep on discussing this issue through other means later on, but I'll give the floor now to Lisa. I won't take up too much of your time because I think we're over time now. I was very happy to hear all the input from the audience and the panelists, but two speakers actually caught my attention with two specific points. First of all, the green funds element is very interesting. When we talk about the climate crisis, we do understand that it's one crisis in many, but it's actually a very different crisis. It's one of the kind. And then I think the second point I found very interesting was the input and importance of parliaments in this process and how they insist on earmarked funds and what their input is in terms of multilateral or bilateral funds. So I think there's a lot to learn about all these mechanisms, and I was very happy to hear it. And thank you so much for organizing this event, and I'll see you soon. One last word, Abdoul Salam, you have the floor. Thank you so much, Professor, for organizing this event and for inviting me to this important discussion. First of all, a word to the former French administrator. I really enjoy working with him and his colleagues. I really appreciated working with this team on vulnerability aspects, and I really wanted to underline how incredible this work has been. I've noticed that there's some sort of pedagogical work to do with parliaments, with all due respect, as they say. Parliaments are very involved in allocations and therefore in accountability. But sometimes their perception of multilateral development banks is not perfect. There's still room for improvement. When I see policy changes and orders given by capitals based on multilateral aid, these orders really show their political stances, and they want to see them translated into multilateral aid. And that gives way to a number of issues and discrepancies. So that's how bilateral and multilateral aid can coexist as well. Now, the World Development Report was published, and last year's was very linked to migrations and society. And one of the discussions we promote is all about diasporas and migrations and opportunities, especially when it comes to finance and investment. We talked about core allocations to Comoros, but in terms of remittance, 250 million euros are sent every year to the Comoros through this diaspora. So how do we deal with the question of remittance? How do we reduce the cost of remittance? That's a topic we could also raise during our discussions. So diaspora and the involvement of diasporas in development. I think there's work to be done on this issue, and I think we could think of investment mechanisms in that aspect. And once again, and one last time, Olivier, in Washington, as part of my work in Washington, I am currently in New York. And I do understand the point you made about New York, but I agree institutions need to communicate better and more.
at 80, c'est une réflexion sur les 80 ans des deux institutions.
There is a reflection ongoing when it comes to the reform of Bretton Woods for the 80th anniversary of the whole system. And we have different stakeholders and eminent figures working on the future of international finance on the medium and long term. So I think this is another topic that we do want to raise and another topic we need to include in our discussions and promote. We'll be discussing this weekend at Bretton Woods, and we'll see what happens then by the General Assembly. So thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for the organization of this meeting. Thank you so much for your input. We will be discussing this further and discussing these bilateral and multilateral aid topics. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Merci, au revoir.